Welcome back to Classic Car Restoration. So far in today's show, we've addressed the leaf springs, shock absorbers, universal joints, and drive shaft on our 62 Thunderbird Sports Roadster. But because this car has been sitting in storage, we don't know what to expect in that gas tank. So what we're going to do today is remove the gas tank and service it and replace any fuel lines we see need replacing. We start at the fuel tank sending unit located in the trunk, and I unscrew the access panel. Okay. With the access panel up and out of the way, we disconnect the power line. And of course, before any of this was started, we disconnected the battery. We don't want any sparks or electrical current flowing when we're dealing with gasoline. Next, we disconnect the fuel line from the sending unit. Now it's time to put the car back up in the air so we can disconnect the fuel filler neck and drop the gas tank. I use a 1/4-inch socket to disconnect the retaining screws that hold the fuel filler neck to the car body. And then I remove the screw that holds the fuel vent, and I pull the neck up and out. And there's our neck. Now it's time to raise the car up and drop that gas tank. Now, luckily we know that our fuel gauge does work and it reads empty, but because gasoline weighs as much as 7 pounds per gallon, and there could be as much as 26 gallons inside of this tank, that's an awful lot of weight. So before you drop your tank, be sure that it's drained. Otherwise you'll be wrestling with it, you're just asking for trouble. With our jack stand in place holding the weight of the tank, we remove the bolts of the straps that hold the tank to the car. Each strap is only held in place with a bolt towards the rear. And then we can remove the jack stand and bring the tank down for inspection. Our tank looks pretty good on the outside. Keller removes the sending unit ring, and we can look inside. The sending unit looks fine, but there are signs of varnish and sludge inside the tank. So we'll send our tank out to a radiator shop to have it boiled and cleaned out. While the tank is at the radiator shop, we inspect the fuel lines and replace any damaged areas. This is done using new steel or rubber fuel line. Well, our gas tank is back from the radiator shop, and while it may not look beautiful on the outside, it's beautiful on the inside. We can now see that all of the rust and all the grunge and all the stuff that was in here from that old gasoline is gone. Now the sending unit, we can see here the float is good. We checked it to make sure that it wasn't full of fuel. And also the sock, which is an internal filter, is in good shape, although you should replace that if you see any signs of clogging or damage. The sending unit fits into a slot in the hole, and then the lock ring slides into place to hold the unit secure. Now it's time to lower the car and add the gas filler neck and then rewire the sending unit. It helps to grease the end of the fuel filler neck so it will slide in easily. It goes back in the way it came out, rotating it to seat it in the body. I add the retaining screws and then tighten them down. Now we go back inside the trunk and hook up the sending unit. I slide the fuel supply line back onto the sending unit and tighten the clamp. Then I hook up the sending unit power line and put the access panel cover back on and tighten that up. The fuel system should be ready to go. Well, we've made some great progress on our project car today. Now when we hit the road, we can be sure that our drive shaft, suspension, and fuel system won't let us down. We'll keep the ball rolling on the next episode of Classic Car Restoration. See you then. For information about fuel tanks and fuel systems, visit us at DIYnetwork.com. We're taking our 1962 Thunderbird Sports Roadster project car out of hibernation and going for our first test drive today. Then we'll come back and get started making repairs on any problems we find and adding some performance enhancements. It's going to be an exciting day. Join us. Welcome to Classic Car Restoration. I'm your host, Steve Mignonti. We've taken our 1962 Thunderbird Sports Roadster out of long-term hibernation, reworked the suspension, drive shaft, and reconditioned the gas tank. Then we added some gasoline, so now we can take it for its very first test drive. We'll get a sense of how it handles and what kind of problems we face so we can fix them. Jump in. To get the most out of a test drive, find an area where you can try out all sorts of driving maneuvers. Drive around and see how the suspension feels. Test the steering by making several small turns. Also, test the brakes and see how they respond, and if they pull. Pump the brakes several times to test them for leaks. The test drive tells me a lot about our project car. Now I have a sense of what needs repair and what areas we can improve on to get better performance. But one thing I did notice right away was that the transmission seems kind of sluggish. Typically that means it's either low on fluid or has a clogged filter. We start the job by draining the transmission fluid out of the pan. Now there's going to be between 4 and 6 quarts of used transmission fluid, so it's going to get kind of messy. So we'll set ourselves up with a catch basin and some cardboard to protect the pavement. Now some transmissions have a drain plug, but our Cruise-O-Matic has a filler neck right here that will loosen, and as we do that, the fluid will start to drain. Now the fluid has kind of a burnt smell to it, which is an indication that the bands could use an adjustment. It's not too bad though. Gotta say, it's actually pretty decent. We'll know more when we pull the pan down and have a look inside. On the Cruise-O-Matic, the filler tube is also the dipstick tube, and we can take that out of the way right now and get this ready for cleaning. I use a socket wrench to remove the transmission pan bolts. And before removing the last bolts, I use a mallet and pry bar to loosen the pan. I remove the last bolts and the pan comes down easily. And off we go to the parts cleaner. And now we take the filter out, and in this case it's just a clip that holds it up there. And a little more fluid is going to come down. Here we go. Oh yeah, this is pretty nasty. Well, let's go clean up our parts. The dipstick and transmission pan go into our parts washer, which is a great item to have around when restoring an old car. The filter from our transmission is full of debris and will have to be replaced. The transmission pan cleans up easily using a scrub sponge. Our next move is to remove the old transmission pan gasket. Now in some cases these things are cork and they're a real bear, but ours is a one-piece unit that is some sort of a compressed fiber, and it seems like it's coming off nicely, which is good. But you want to be certain to get all of the old gasket out of the place or you'll be asking for leaks. Then I clean the face of the transmission using brake cleaning fluid and a clean rag. I also clean up the dripping transmission fluid. Then I install a brand new transmission filter. It's a little spring clip here that retains the filter in place. Some transmission designs use screws, but Ford has a nice simple little deal right here, this spring, and it's done. Next I apply gasket adhesive to the gasket and to the clean and dry transmission pan, and I place the gasket onto the pan lip. The adhesive will keep the gasket from shifting during the reinstallation. And then I spray the gasket and pan again with the adhesive, so it will stick nicely to the transmission and not leak. The clean transmission pan goes back up and I add the bolts. I use a hand tool instead of a power wrench to secure the bolts because we just want them snug tight. Not too tight, that could split the gasket and cause a leak. As with all installations, if a bolt doesn't feel like it's going in smoothly, back it out and put it in by hand first, then use your tool. Okay, now with all of the bolts seated and snug, we'll make the rounds in a circular pattern, just giving them a little more of a snug, and that's it. The dipstick tube and filler neck is next. We route this back up behind the engine block. And there's no reason to use any kind of a sealant on these threads because this is a compression coupling, and with the right amount of torque, the right amount of tightening, there's no leak problem here. Since our transmission is completely empty, I'll add 4 quarts of Type F automatic transmission fluid to the system. Then I'll run the car in neutral for a few minutes, shut it off, run it again, and then check the dipstick and add more transmission fluid if necessary. Our transmission belly is full and we're ready to take our T-Bird back out on the road. If you'd like any information about transmission work or anything else you see on our show, visit us on the web at DIYnetwork.com. When we come back, we'll refurbish our drum brakes and continue with the restoration of our 1962 Thunderbird Sports Roadster. Welcome back to Classic Car Restoration. In 1965, Ford released a front disc brake option for the Thunderbird, but our 1962 Thunderbird Sports Roadster has drum brakes. But that's not such a bad thing. They're big 11-inch units and they're very effective. The only thing I noticed, though, was on our test drive earlier, the car seems to want to grab a little bit when you use the brakes and it pulls to the left. So our drums do need a rebuild. Let's dig in. I start by removing the hubcap and the lug nuts. The wheel comes off, and then the brake drum comes off. Oh yeah, that explains some things right there. We can see that we've got some rust and scoring inside of the brake drum itself. And when we take a look at the shoes, oh yeah, we can see where the wheel cylinders have been leaking fluid onto the shoes, which causes them to become very grabby, which explains the way the car felt. When I hit the brakes, it just sort of wanted to lurch. So we need to fix this and replace all these parts. First we disconnect the shoe anchor springs. There's 2 per side. And these allow the brake shoes to be removed. I use a special brake tool to remove the shoe hold-down spring retainers. This tool is inexpensive and available at any local auto parts store. Okay, now the brake shoe anchor springs come off. We start with the primary side using the brake tool. You simply put it on the anchor pin, get it under the spring end, and roll it around. The spring comes off. Same for the secondary side. Now here's the parking brake and the self-adjuster link and cable. We take these off. The anchor bar. The strut comes off and then the shoes come out. And here's those old shoes. We can see these things are worn down. In fact, these are riveted, old-style riveted shoes. And you can see that the rivets themselves are actually worn away. So these shoes, and you can see there's no meat left on them either. These things are gone. So no wonder it didn't stop so well. I remove the parking brake actuation arm by moving it back on the spring and snapping it apart from the parking brake cable. While we clean up our backing plate, we'll send the brake drums off to the machine shop to have them turned. So if your brakes are too far gone, you can always buy new drums. But ours are okay, so we'll have them turned. Next, I remove the wheel cylinders by removing the retaining bolts in the brake backing plates. We have a feeling that the wheel cylinders are bad from evidence of leaks that we saw underneath the car. Because you can buy new wheel cylinders for under 25 bucks per corner of the car, there's no reason to rebuild the old ones. So we'll take this leaky old baby and get rid of it. Before we reassemble the brakes with our new parts, we clean the brake backing plates and remove all the dirt and road grime that's accumulated over the many years. I spray the area down with engine cleaner and use a toothbrush or other small bristle brush to get into the cracks and crevices, and then wipe it off using a clean rag. With the backing plates cleaned up, now we begin the reassembly, and it all starts with our fresh wheel cylinders. The wheel cylinder slips into the mounting hole and is locked in place from behind the plate. We'll be reusing the plungers from the old wheel cylinders. They're perfectly good. So hit them with a little bit of lube on the ends, put them in place. The next step in the reassembly is installing the brake shoes, one of the major components. But we have to remember to transfer the parking brake actuation lever from the old brake shoes. And that's done by removing this horseshoe-shaped clip. And then this comes right out. And we transfer it onto our new shoe, like so. But instead of using the old clip, we'll use a new one. Here's one right here. And they go on like that. There we go. Now, when I mentioned the leading shoe and the trailing shoe, what we're actually talking about is the front and the back shoe. The difference in them is that the leading shoe actually has a shorter friction surface on it. We'll start by putting our new brake shoe retaining nails in from the back side of the backing plate. It's 2 per side. I install the leading shoe by first reattaching the parking brake actuation lever to the parking brake cable. It simply snaps onto the cable, and then the shoe slips into place, seating onto the 2 brake shoe nails. And the shoe is secured by installing the 2 hold-down spring retainers onto each nail. The parking brake strut goes back on, and the secondary brake shoe goes back on. Like the leading shoe, it's slipped into place over the brake shoe nails, and the parking brake strut is secured. The hold-down spring clip retainers are secured over the nails, and the new brake shoes are installed. One thing you want to keep in mind is that the self-adjusters for the brakes are so inexpensive that there's no reason to reuse the original ones. They tend to get rusty and they get stuck. Each adjuster is marked for the right or left side. Put the adjuster together and add some lithium grease to the shaft. Then close the adjuster down all the way. So the brake shoes are fully collapsed and the drum goes on easily. We'll adjust them in a few minutes. The top anchor plate goes back on, snapping into place, and then the parking brake cable and guide go back on, pulling the cable over to the anchor pin. The bottom parking brake retainer plate snaps into place, and the primary shoe spring hooks onto the shoe and is stretched to the top of the anchor plate. And then the secondary spring is attached to the shoe and is stretched to the anchor plate. Then the bottom adjuster spring is attached to the shoe and the retainer plate. Now that the brakes are reassembled, we'll take a little bit of brake clean and wipe off any fingerprints or grease so we don't have contamination. It could cause the brakes to slip a little bit for the first few stops. And we'll do the same for our freshly turned drums. You can see these have come back from the machine shop and they look beautiful. They're ready for service, although once again, to prevent any kind of contamination, we'll clean them out real quick with some brake cleaner. Before I put the brake drum back on, I expand the brake shoes outward by turning the star adjuster. I'll test the drum, and if it's still too loose, I'll continue adjusting the shoes and expanding the shoes out to meet the drum. When it becomes hard to turn the star adjuster, I use a brake spoon to do the trick, inserting it from behind the brake backing plate. The drum goes back on and is good if there is a small amount of drag felt when you turn the wheel. Well, that does it for the brakes. Now we can stop as well as we can go. And with any luck, we probably won't have to do these brakes again for a few more years. When we come back, we're going to upgrade the rear axle by converting from an open differential to a limited slip differential so we can burn both tires.